Well, let's see. We have sort of a new author. Well, not really new. I mean, we've done Deleuze before, uh, and we've done lots of Nietzsche, so probably some of this is pretty familiar. Um, of course, one thing to think about with respect to the style of philosophy that Deleuze is interested in, um, it's, he hasn't totally developed his um, ideas that he exposits in difference and repetition between the dogmatic image of truth and what's the opposite of the dogmatic image, the creative image or whatever
Mm,
his mature philosophy is supposed to be more about creation and not description.
mhm.
The whole idea of philosophy up to him, according to him, although there are plenty of exceptions to this, but the idea that the major lineage in philosophy attempts to carve reality at the joints, that is to say, to um, capture the structure of the world, the structure of reality in language, in mental, either representations if you're post Descartes or simply in your recognition of the uh, formal nature of reality if you're Plato up to say the modern era or so. And he wants to disregard that. The upshot of that, of course, is that you always have to ask whenever he's writing about another philosopher whether it's really that philosopher or whether it's Deleuze. If
Mm,
he's using the philosopher as a creative springboard to say something not necessarily true, but interesting and creative and new, different, or
yeah.
if it's like an exegesis of that person's work. And so it's a weird kind of hybrid thing where it's yes, it is exegesis, but uh, there are certain aspects of the exegesis that seem almost contrary to the natural reading of some of these ideas. Like for instance, with eternal return, often it's called eternal return of the same. That's one way that it is described. I don't know if I'd have to look in Zarathustra if that specific phrase, eternal return of the same, is ever there, or if that's just a kind of summary that people use to describe the theory. I mean, in the gay science, it's really more like an allegory. I don't think the word in that order, eternal return of the same, ever comes forward, but the kind of I don't know, standard reading of this collection of ideas in Nietzsche is that it's the same that returns, right? I mean, so like you all know the aphorism from the gay science about the demon coming to you in your lonely nest of lonelinesses. Do you know about this? That's
Mhm.
oh, we should look at that in case it's not like just kind of there in the back of your mind. Essentially, what it is, I'll just paraphrase and then we can read through it. In the gay science, Nietzsche writes, imagine that, whatever, in the depths of your loneliness, uh, a voice comes to you and says, behold, what you live now, you will live eternally more, innumerable times. And then the question is, would you affirm that? Or first of all, he says, would you gnash your teeth and curse the demon? Or would you affirm it as the greatest wisdom that was ever spoken? But there, I mean, it seems pretty obvious that the idea is that the same returns, right? And so
Mm,
the thing about Deleuze's reading of it is that really what he wants to say is it's not really so much the eternal return of the same, it's the eternal return of difference.
mhm,
And so we'll have to figure out how difference and sameness can be brought together.
mhm,
But just there as an example, I mean, the whole first chapter really is about, the various interpretations and consequences of this either idea or doctrine of eternal return. But the question is it eternal return of the same, or is it eternal return of the opposite of the same, or is there some perhaps insufficiency in thinking about sameness and difference as opposites? Are they, in some respect, co-constitutive of each other?
Mm-hmm.
Let's get that excerpt from the Gay Science up because it's one of the major textual sources that Deleuze is drawing from here. Just a second. Gay Science, Eternal Return. I don't remember which aphorism it is, but we'll find it in a second. It's number 341. That's right. Okay, yes. Here, I'll share my screen so we can see it. It's fairly short. It's only about a paragraph long. Let me find the internet here. Okay. Hmm. The heaviest burden. What if a demon crept after you into your loneliest, loneliest. I don't know why that word is so hard to say. Loneliest, loneliest. What if a demon crept after you into your loneliest loneliness? Some say loneliest loneliness 7 times fast. Loneliest loneliness.
Yeah, that's hard.
Okay. What if a demon crept after you into your loneliest loneliness some day or night and said to you, this life as you live it at present, and have lived it, you must live it once more, and also innumerable times, and there will be nothing new in it. But every pain, and every joy, and every thought, and every sigh, and all the unspeakably small and great in thy life must come to you again, and all in the same series and sequence. And similarly, this spider, and this moonlight among the trees, and similarly this moment and I myself. The eternal sandglass of existence will ever be turned once more, and you with it, you speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon that so spoke? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment in which you would answer him, you are a god, and never did I hear anything so divine? If that thought acquired power over you as you are, it would transform you, and perhaps crush you. The question with regard to all and everything, do you want this once more, and also for innumerable times, would lie as the heaviest burden upon your activity? Or how would you have to become favorably inclined to yourself and to life so as to long for nothing more ardently than for this last eternal sanctioning and sealing?
Mm.
So there's some question here about what return means. I mean, the other thing about Nietzsche and his style, and Deleuze takes this on board as part of his style. He's in many ways heavily influenced by Nietzsche, but Nietzsche is kind of the master of the oxymoron, and even the phrase eternal return is an oxymoron. Why do I say it's an oxymoron? What's oxymoronic about eternal return?
Well, for something to be eternal, it's kind of just extending into, let's say, infinity or something, and the idea of that returning kind of breaks that direction.
Yeah, yeah. So there's this sense of extension, I guess, maybe not necessarily physical extension, but what is presupposed in the very idea of return?
Well, that there's an end, and then from the end you can loop back to the
Exactly,
beginning.
absence. You have to at
Yeah.
some point be absent in order to return, otherwise you never leave.
Hmm.
Huck, I think, I mean, you're talking about like, is it return to sameness or return to difference? I mean, when I read this, I mean, it's difficult to get my thoughts moving on this. It's all, it's almost as if like what Deleuze is trying to draw out from this is that like in the, I guess, I mean, I don't want to jump too far forward, but like, in the dice throw and like committing to just a single throw of the dice, it's like in committing to difference and that sort of affirmation of life and difference, uh, in committing to that and that sort of fullness of a life, that would be the kind of life that you would be okay if it returned in, if that makes sense.
Sure. I think the important thing to see here is that if we're trying to have fixed definitions of terms, it's going to be contrary both to Nietzsche and Deleuze, right? I mean, and
Sure. Yeah.
the very idea of an oxymoron, right, suggests so an oxymoron is generally some kind of bringing together, maybe even unity, although we have to be careful with the idea of unity, but some kind of way of reconciling opposites but not reconciling them so much that the tension completely disappears, right? And so,
Mhm.
the solution, or even the word solution, is a bit of a problem, right? I mean, because the word solution, I was looking up the etymology, and it is contested what the etymology is, but I mean, one pretty plausible etymology of solution is that it uh, is based in words having to do with unity, right? So like the SOL, like soul, solo, this kind of thing, right? The one sort of idea. So, the very idea of solutions at all, if you've got something confusing, if you've got a problem, maybe the point of problems is not that they be solved. If what we mean by that is that we resolve them into some kind of conceptual unity or something like that, right? Um, and yet, you've got to somehow, uh, if we're going to bring them into language, if we're going to bring them into thought, we have to somehow be able to hold them at the same time. So when you have a kind of paradoxical or even self-contradictory notion like eternal return, um, we have to figure out how it's possible to keep the difference together with the somehow, I don't want to call it unity, but the interconnection or interrelationship of opposites. And so I think that there are a lot of things in this, even just in this little thought experiment, that um, kind of, or that this aphorism that sort of maybe point in multiple directions. I mean, for one thing, it's sort of interesting that Nietzsche sets it up as an either or, right? Because if it's true that what he's doing is trying to express truth in paradox, right, or truth through paradox, or something like that, maybe this sort of less fixed, less static or abstract notion of truth, but truth as it's expressed in becoming. It's sort of weird that he would set it up as an either or. Either you gnash your teeth or you affirm it.
Mm.
Seems like maybe the most adequate way to deal with this is to try to come to recognition of the interrelation of these two choices, right? That it's not really one or the other exactly. I mean, I think that with respect to the notion of suffering and the very idea of affirming suffering, I guess, for its own sake and not just as a test or a problem that is to be solved so that you can achieve the optimal ideal existence. Maybe there's something like that here too, where it's not so much about just choosing between gnashing your teeth and saying, oh, this is terrible, or saying, oh, this is the greatest thing I've ever heard, but actually maybe what is being affirmed is the gnashing itself, right?
Mm.
Or there's some sort of relationship so that it's not a completely exclusive choice, maybe.
How is Nietzsche? Is there any writings on how he thinks about time, at least when he's talking about the eternal return?
How he thinks about time. Well, first of all, the thing about um, eternal return as a doctrine, I mean, it's odd to call it a doctrine, first of all, because it's usually presented aphoristically or allegorically, right? Like here, it's not exactly a doctrine because there are no real assertions. It's first of all, just imagine that this would happen. And then secondly, it's a question, how would you react?
Hmm.
And in Zarathustra, it's all allegorical, right? So that you have characters that sort of um, perform the various interpretations that one might have, but it's not, coming straight out and saying that this is his belief, this is his
Yeah,
so
yeah.
on. With respect to time, I mean, there's also some controversy about whether Nietzsche really believed that eternal return was a cosmological principle in the sense of
Mm.
physical science or not. There are sketches where he tries to work out uh, the the following theory that if time is infinite and matter is finite, that you necessarily will have an infinite number of recurrences of any configuration of matter. It turns out that that is just false. mathematically it's not guaranteed, even if you have finite time and infinite or infinite time and finite matter, that you would have infinite recurrences of the same configurations. So, you know, it seems most likely that he thinks of it as a allegorical way of, performing existence, I guess.
Hmm.
I, I hesitate to call it something like a theory of time in the
Yeah.
sense that even, like someone like Kant would have a theory of time, or certainly
Hmm.
not in the sense of physics or whatever. But he also thinks that it's descriptive of reality.
Hmm.
However, it's unclear how far one could go with eternal return as a scientific theory.
Hmm. It's kind of, I don't know, it reminds me of the categorical imperative in some ways
Uh-huh.
of this. Well, this, let's say, this action that you're choosing to do right now, are you willing to like will
Right.
it so that it returns eternally? It's like going from unity to like multiplicity. And it's the same thing even with like the categorical imperative. It's like something that's singular becoming universal, right? Or you will that it be universal.
I definitely think will is a huge part of this, right?
Hmm.
And of course, according to Deleuze, will has a very specific definition. It's not just like free choice or something like that. It
Right.
has to do with this underlying battle of forces and this kind of thing. But I think you're absolutely right that there is this sense that there's kind of a maxim that is being adopted here. However, it's not a maxim in the sense of a fixed rule that is, I mean, I suppose maybe it's universally applicable in Nietzsche. I'm not sure. I mean, that seems not to gel with the whole um, kind of character and attitude of Nietzsche, the idea that this is a fixed rule that
Right.
simply, once you discover it, you just follow it every single time. It seems sort of like, to the extent it's a maxim, it's more like the following maxim: read the room, or like, read your life, which means that, yeah, read the room is a rule you can follow. However, the way it's expressed and implemented is going to be completely different in different rooms, you know.
Hmm.
And so I think that's one of the ways of looking at how you can bring difference and sameness together in Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche, that there's maybe a more fundamental sort of rule that is itself always expressed differently.
Hmm.
Um, the thing that I guess we would want to avoid if we want to be true to Deleuze is thinking that as he would say, the being of becoming, or this rule that is always expressed differently. We'd want to avoid saying that, well, what is ontologically or logically most fundamental is the rule, the sameness, the stasis, and so on. And then there are different expressions of that. That would be like maybe more of a Platonic or Aristotelian view with relation to, the sort of, or Kantian view with respect to the relationship between rules and implementations of rules, or the relationship between genera and species, or concepts and iterations of concepts, and so on. That's not what we would want. Um,
Yeah.
because the concept itself or the rule itself has to be ever changing, right?
Hmm.
It has to be the sort of thing that is um, always expressed in terms of the interrelation of forces, for instance, right? Becoming is at the heart of the rule, and yet it's a rule.
Yeah.
And as I was reading, as kind of a primer for this reading, I was doing on Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. They had it was like Nietzsche's ethical and political theory, something like that. It's pretty long article. I don't remember who the author was, but they explicitly made that connection between um, this sort of aphorism and the categorical imperative. But then, very like most of the article was partitioned out and kind of examining like Nietzsche's opposition to like normative statements, right? And because that kind of assumed that there's a unity that at which you could like apply these things sort of universally. So I think that's definitely like there's a parallel there, but I think they're approaching things from like very different standpoints. So yeah, Huck, I mean, I think that's a very good analogy of like, yeah, read the room. Like it is true. It's an aphorism, but it's hard to see how like that would have like a universal expression. Like it could take a particular expression for people.
Well, I mean, you could turn that into a rule. Always read the room appropriately. Right? But the thing is, like, what that rule consists in, or like be flexible, or like,
Yeah,
just learn
yeah,
how to be a good improviser or roll with the punches. I mean, it's funny. We
yeah,
have lots of different ways of expressing this idea that, like, there is a right way to be that is always different and always context sensitive and so on. It's kind of interesting because you mentioned normativity. I guess one big difference between if this is a maxim in the way that the categorical imperative is a maxim, I mean, I think one big difference is going to be with respect to the relationship between normativity and action, right? Because the whole thing about the categorical imperative is that normativity is prior to action. In other words, there's a right way to act, and you can fail to act that way.
Mhm.
But normativity is supposed to be a guide to action.
Right.
However, with Nietzsche, at least the way Deleuze is presenting this, and I think that it's actually pretty apt.
Yeah, it's inverted for sure.
Values are not normative in the sense of being guides to action. They are expressions of action,
Mhm.
right? And so, like, this gets to the whole metaphysics of selfhood and subjecthood and so on. Like the slogany way of saying it is what Nietzsche, I don't know if wants to return to is quite the right way to say it, but one thing he likes about pre-Socratics and Homeric Greeks and so on is that they didn't have this notion of um, a sort of abstract subject that is separate from its action. The slogany way of saying that is who you are is what you do. There is no
Mhm.
difference between who you are and what you do, and that division is what enables the theory of sin to be possible. That there is a essence to who you are that is separate from your action, and so you can sin against your own essence, maybe as a child of God or whatever. Um, that all suggests that normativity, the right way to be, the right way to act as a subject, is separate from what you actually do. The only way you can sin is if you're somehow doing something other than what you ought to do. And so the normativity is supposed to guide your action, it's supposed to help you choose what to do. But here it's somehow being expressed through the choices you make uh, directly.
Mhm.
Yeah, so it is inverted, definitely. It's interesting, though, because it's sort of like, this also gets back to the slogan that Nietzsche often is quoted. Well, it's a quotation of someone else, Pindar, the idea of becoming who you are as an imperative, become who you are. Well, that seems not to require any notion of free will, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's like, how can you fail to become who you are? Well, I guess the way that you can fail to become who you are is to fail to affirm who you are, right? Because I guess if you're going to be determinists about it, if you're going to act however you act, if who you are just is what you do, um, the only way that you could fail to do that is to feel bad about it, to feel guilty about it, to feel like you're a failure or whatever, which means not to affirm it. But even there, I mean, doesn't that sort of affirmation require some kind of freedom, right? I mean, this is kind of similar, Sandesh, to what we were talking about with Korsgaard, where it's like we could imagine. So first of all, we could imagine like really, really determined life, like amoebas or something that don't even have any kind of consciousness and just I mean, there is no real identity to the amoeba beyond what it does. It just, seeks food or reproduces or whatever. And then we could imagine maybe like a minimally conscious life form that always just does what it's going to do because it's determined and yet can feel good or bad about it.
Mhm.
But the thing is like, is the feeling good or bad also determined, or is it free?
Mhm.
Even if you're always going to just do what you do, if you've got this sort of internal, whatever, representation, or at least capacity to take a stance on your action, if that's not determined, if it's the sort of thing that one could express an imperative, you should affirm who you are, even though you're always going to just do what you do. It seems like for that imperative to actually even be sensible, you have to have some kind of freedom. You have to be
Mhm.
able to fail to act on the imperative.
Yeah.
Um, so it's tricky. I mean, there's a completely coherent way to interpret Nietzsche as a thoroughgoing determinist. The only problem with it is then we have to ask, what did Nietzsche think he was doing when he was writing these books? Right? It's like, why write the books if you're just going to do what you're going to do anyway, and if everybody's just going to do what they do anyway, and even that sort of affirmation, feeling good or bad about what you do is determined. Um,
I mean, is there a level of sort of like will can operate at the level of intention, but actions and intentions maybe aren't exactly the same thing? I mean, is that? I mean, again, like I guess I'm trying to find a solution here to this. Uh, Paradox isn't really the right word, but tension. But I mean, I just feel like you can kind of have it both ways in that sense. That right, like we could imagine a being that sort of is on the rails and determined in what it does, but then sort of has this sort of like free will sort of internally in its thoughts, right? I mean, that's doesn't seem
well,
like
yeah, that's what I was
impossible.
talking about with like even more minimally expressed than that. It's like, do you feel good about what you've done, or do you feel bad about what you've
Mhm.
done?
Yeah.
But for us to have a sensible imperative, in other words, affirm who you are.
Mhm.
I mean, if I'm determined not to affirm it, or if I am determined to affirm it, that imperative doesn't have any meaning. It has no content, right? Because there is no way to violate it. It's
Mhm.
just there's a difference between a description and an imperative, I guess is what I'm saying.
Mhm.
Right. Like a description might be you will affirm who you are because you're determined to do it. But that's not the same thing as the imperative, affirm who you are, which requires that it could possibly be violated if it's an imperative.
Yeah.
Is it clear what I'm saying?
Hmm.
Yeah, no, I get that. Yeah, I feel like I was kind of saying that. Yeah, I guess I'm just like thinking through how it doesn't seem that odd. I mean, I don't know. Like
Well, I want to get
we
back
talk about like
to
actions and intentions all the time, right? That like you can have.
sure.
Um,
I mean, I'm actually, as I said, I think you could come up with a coherent description of the origin of Nietzsche's books and so on. What I'm trying to do is take on his first person perspective a little bit. I
yeah.
think like, what was he doing? And actually, just as a stylistic thing, Nietzsche is often like one thing people often say, first of all, when you read Nietzsche, is that he uses lots of exclamation points. Now, one of the things that's interesting, this is particular to German, is that uh, as a matter of style, imperatives are sentences that always take on exclamation points. So technically, grammatically, or I guess with respect to the style, if you have an affirmative or an imperative sentence, you're supposed to put an exclamation point.
Mm.
And there are a number of places where you get these exclamation points that seem basically, it doesn't even require much reading between the lines, that he's actually giving us an imperative. Um, but then does he think that he's giving an imperative? In other words, does he think it's possible to fall short of who you ought to be, which then requires that he think in the same terms as the Christian notion of a soul as separate from its action. So
Hmm.
maybe there, if that's the way he's thinking, that as I said with Deleuze, Deleuze explicitly wants to move away from the descriptive use of philosophy, the dogmatic image of thought, towards a creative image. But if imperatives are actually just descriptions, then it's a little hard to see how Nietzsche isn't just falling back into the dogmatic image, a descriptive use of philosophy. Everything's determined and so on.
Mhm.
I'm not sure. Any further thoughts on that before we kind of jump into the main text? All right.
Yeah, maybe it's just with like interpretation. I mean,
Mhm.
I guess it depends on like how you interpret it as a creative reader. And mm, yeah, and not like maybe arrive at a conclusion that, oh, it's dogmatic or something, and trying to find like, I don't know, maybe that's what Deleuze would say, right?
Well, I think the word dogmatic in the dogmatic image of thought is a kind of technical use of the term. It really well, it means more than just descriptive. It is kind of a pejorative term. It is evaluative, right? It because it's descriptive is a lot more neutral, but the structure of the dogmatic image is that it's a mind to world direction of fit, right? So like what the dogmatic image does is describe reality, and so the truth of a description is warranted by its correspondence to reality, right? That's what he wants to get rid of.
Yeah.
And he wants to supplant that with a notion of creating reality through philosophy, right? So, I mean, essentially, like all philosophy is a speech act. You create states of affairs through how you use language
Mm,
instead of using language to describe pre-existing states of affairs,
yeah, yeah.
right? But it's fairly hard to gel that with the deterministic reading of Nietzsche's philosophy, right? I mean, it's like, I don't know, if everything is determined, how could you ever create anything? Well, you could create things that are new. It's just it wouldn't be you creating it, right? It would be
Mm.
the will or whatever, you know.
Mhm.
Um, I guess it's not so much, yeah, the tension isn't really with respect to creation versus description. It's more with respect to imperatives as meaningful sentences versus descriptions. Because it's hard to think of how an imperative could actually be a sensible sentence if it's not possible to violate it, right? So, like with, this is probably well known to both of you, but I'll just kind of state it for reasons of intellectual hygiene. So like with the verification principle of truth, right? So like the widely renounced positivist notion defended by A.J. Ayer and so on that uh, a sentence truth value just is uh, the conditions under which it can be verified, right? Which means then, so one of the most obvious problems with that is that if sentences can only be true if they can be true or I'm sorry, sentences can only be meaningful if they can be true or false, then you get problems where it's like, well, does that mean imperatives aren't meaningful?
Mm.
Imperatives aren't true or false. And so then the idea is, well, no, I mean, I guess one way of thinking about what the meaning of imperative is just the way that it causes behavior, right? So the meaning of uh, eat your tuna fish or whatever. Um, it's not exactly true. However, it can be felicitous if that causes whoever I want to eat the tuna fish, it causes them to eat the tuna fish, right?
Mhm.
So maybe there's a way to keep imperatives as meaningful sentences without um, bringing on something like free will or a neutral subject that's independent of its action or something. But I don't really think that that's the way that Nietzsche is using imperatives, either literally imperative sentences or just the sort of general atmosphere of, having a moral project that he's working on, helping people live life in a better way. It really does seem like he is maybe almost like as a sort of repression, he's tied to this idea of a self that can choose which way to act.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way.
Yeah. Um,
I mean, as my I might have been Sam Cantor that was telling me this. He was like, "Yeah, I don't know if free will exists, but it does for me. You know, like I have it."
yeah, well,
Sort of
that's
operating
Kant's
from like,
description of it. Yeah, definitely. Right. It's like Kant's description about the relationship between free will and morality is that, well, if it's true that we can come to a rational analysis of what the right thing to do would be for some being that actually does have free will, and given, according to Kant, that we can't experience our actions except as though they're freely chosen,
right, yeah, it seems like they do.
justified in
Yeah,
applying the rational morality to our own situation, right? Yeah, so it's like it's empirically real. There's no question about it. In fact, it seems like it's the most obvious fact of consciousness, you
yeah,
know.
yeah.
Um,
You have to take it as such. But I mean, yeah, but
I think maybe more productive ways of thinking about free will, the free will question, though, would be maybe to think about it more in terms of third personal versus first personal perspectives,
mhm.
right?
Yeah, from outside the system, it what does it look like?
From outside the system, what does it look like? But also not to discount what it looks like from inside the system,
Yeah.
right? One of the points that Korsgaard spent a lot of time dealing with is so there's a fairly well-known way of describing a solution to the fact value dichotomy distinction, which holds that however organisms act just is what they value. So for instance, my go-to example is always like, okay, so you have a potted flower that you put by the window. Wherever the sun is, the flower is going to grow towards the light of the sun, right? The warmth and the light of the sun. Well, there's a very literal way of describing that, which holds that the flower on some level values the warmth and light of the sun. Of course, from the third personal perspective, you don't have to describe it as value. You can just describe it as biological facts and so on. But what Korsgaard says is she doesn't talk about flowers, she talks more about conscious things. But from the point of view of the flower, if the flower had a point of view, all of those facts would actually be values, but only from the first person point of view. And so maybe that's a way of thinking about the free will question as well. Yes, you can always describe all of our actions through deterministic descriptions, but those third personal descriptions don't actually exhaust the first personal description, right? And so that sort of dual aspect compatibilism between determinism in the third personal view versus freedom in the first personal view is pretty close to what Kant says, you know. But that's why it's so important for me to think about what is Nietzsche's first person point of view here, right? It's like he seems like he wants to deny the presuppositions of freedom, for instance, that we have a subject that legislates, that can choose, and so on, right? But it sure seems like that's what he thinks he's doing as writing this, as when he's writing this, and so um, it's a fairly complicated perspective to get into. It's hard to imagine exactly the way he was seeing what he was doing. Uh, in
Yeah.
any case, maybe we can jump into um, some Deleuze. I was telling Daniel that we can go slow with this. I mean, I'm sure we're all very busy, and I wouldn't mind having like an extra week before the next reading is due, the next chapter. So maybe we can spend a couple weeks on this and then figure out who's going to kind of lead the discussion for chapter two. Uh,
Yeah, that's good with me. Finals and juries are next week for Baylor, so I'll be slammed all next week, and then I'm blessedly free after that.
okay, well, maybe in 2 weeks from now you can.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm pretty slammed until the middle of June, so.
right, right. Yeah, I mean, just speaking from my
Yeah.
from my personal perspective, as we were just
Yeah.
saying.
Okay. So maybe let's go a little slow. We can dwell on details here. I think that there's a lot to talk about, even just in the preface, Deleuze's preface from I think 1988. I believe that's when this was published. So after his two big pre-Guattari books, and then also after Capitalism and Schizophrenia, that series, he writes this, and it's um, extremely refreshing to read because it's not hard to understand. It's fairly straightforward, and it's also retrospective and from, in from a older age. He's older when he writes this, and um, I think he just sort of avoids some of the more annoying elements of like 1970s postmodernism in the preface. However, one thing that I noticed is that there are a lot of, I was telling Daniel, it's sort of like walking along a desert landscape that had, there are a bunch of stones strewn around on the ground, and under every stone, there's like some massive subterranean complex of ideas. So there are certain words that he drops that actually require a fair amount of unpacking. And so
Mm.
good to go kind of slow. But maybe I'll start with you all. What did you take from the preface? I also have the outline of the preface here in case you want to remind yourself what he covered here.
Well, kind of the first point you made about the difference between like Anglophone philosophy and sort of Nietzsche's, like what he took from that and sort of his influence on that, and just like the, I don't know, the problems he's responding to essentially, right? And
Hmm.
like why,
Sure.
like yeah, like why is he writing this?
Hmm.
Um, what was the phrase, like the good sense of Anglophone philosophy or something like that, which I thought was very like kind of a funny way of putting it. Trying to think, see what that was. I got to look at my own.
Well, the big thing is that so first of all, yes, you're absolutely right that you have to understand what Nietzsche is saying, both within the context of his own writing, which is fairly rich and has all sorts of avenues and directions it takes, but then also with respect to what Deleuze would call the major lineage, the major tradition of philosophy, which
Mm.
being centered, it's Parmenides, Team Parmenides versus Team Heraclitus, Um, and so how is Nietzsche both negating, but then in that negation, doing something creative? And I guess just as a very high level kind of conceptual framing here, we want to think about what Deleuze's relationship or opinion of negation is in general. Um, what did you guys take from the chapter with respect to Deleuze's attitude towards negation?
Um, I think he is opposed to negation as it appears in like dialectical thinking.
And how does it appear in dialectical thinking? What's so objectionable about it to him?
Um, well, I think he's resisting this idea of opposition and contradiction, and how you in dialectical thinking there's always like a yes and a no, and
Mhm.
that's not really difference. Um, and I think he's talking about how negation arises out of action and out of like this struggle between forces as opposed to it being the essence of something, right?
Yeah, sure. I think to clarify it a little bit, maybe even prior to or kind of behind the question of negation is the question of what do we think difference is, or how do we think about difference, right? And
Yeah,
so,
like is difference a thing that has to be solved for? Or is that like is difference like justified on its own terms as or is
yeah,
that affirming?
exactly. I mean, one way of saying it is difference negative or positive,
Right.
right? And so, like,
Deleuze wants it to be positive, I think.
he wants it to be positive because he wants it to be creative, right?
Hmm.
He thinks
Yeah.
of difference as the the creative principle of nature, the creative principle of existence, which I think he takes largely from the tradition spanning Spinoza through Goethe, and there are a number of other people that think about difference this way as the creative principle of life, as opposed to absence, whatever is left over in between things that are different.
Mhm.
Right. So one way of thinking about this with respect to his kind of process ontology is difference as negation presupposes first entities or identities, and difference is whatever it's a way of describing the relationship between identities, right? So that the
Mhm.
relationship of difference is parasitic on the existence of identities or of entities. And he wants to invert that. Right. So the whole thing about process ontology is that it posits that relationships give rise to entities. It's not that that relationships are ways of describing the interaction of entities. Any entity is itself actually just a snapshot of a process or of a relationship.
Mhm.
Everything's always in relation.
Mhm.
So if you're thinking of difference as whatever is in the gap between two entities, that gets the picture completely the other way around from how it should be, according to Deleuze. And it means that difference is that absence or that gap or that nothing, that void. In other words, that difference is a kind of death, right?
Mhm.
It's destructive, right? And so he wants to think of difference now in the affirmative sense as, difference as becoming, difference as life-giving, that constant sense of flow, change, flux that gives rise to entities, but is not just a second order description of the relationship between entities, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I think it's important to keep that in the back of our mind because the major lineage, so the Parmenidean lineage, that holds that being is the thing and difference or becoming or whatever is just either an illusion or somehow derivative from being or somehow, a second class citizen or something like that. That is actually a destructive way of thinking. And so he wants Nietzsche to be kind of like this avatar for difference as the creative principle.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so that's kind of the context when I was saying that that's the context that he's reacting against, or I mean, we have to be careful about the word react as well, because
Mhm.
there are two different
Yeah.
types of forces, active and reactive. Anybody want to say something about that?
Yeah, he thinks like like reactionary is like this inherently like non-affirming, you know, negative, destructive impulse. And
Yeah,
so that's not what he means by reactive.
that's right. And however, it's really complicated, right? Because actually, so like the surface reading of Nietzsche, which is kind of maybe like the Manosphere podcast reading of Nietzsche, is that um, there are these vibrant, visceral masters that do what they want, take no prisoners, just live their desires, their interests, and so on. Don't think much about it. And then there are people that are the losers, miss out on that kind of pleasure, can't exert their will, and then they invent this whole thing to get back at the masters, invent this whole theory of sin and ethics and all this kind of stuff. But that's not really a very sufficient reading because the whole thing about resentment, ressentiment, right?
Mhm.
This idea, ressentiment is actually the engine of creativity, right?
Mhm.
It's like
Yeah.
ressentiment is something that enables thought in general. That's something he claims towards the end of this. And so there's something deeply creative about flipping the values of the world, right? So reaction is not, it's not in itself totally negative or totally destructive. It has a sort, when it's properly understood, it has um, a sort of creative power to it. One of the ways he describes this, I think, more in the body of chapter one, is this pathos of distance, which we should probably hold for now. But the pathos of distance is just like even the masters who are pretty unreflective, in their activity, they separate themselves from from others, right? So like they hold the slaves in disregard. They're kind of disgusted by the slaves. But that pathos of distance is something that's required to, uh, for one thing, have an identity, right? Have a sort of strong sense of a life project. You need to be able to um, say that some things uh, do not accord with your values and other things do. And so it's that sort of, you know, mm, even there's a kind of reaction, right? It's like you react to the things that you think are beneath you or the things that you don't value. And so even there, at this very basic level, there's a sense that, you know, it's not a clear dichotomy between activity and reactivity. There's always something creative about reaction itself. Now, to get more into the the text of the preface, you know, Daniel, you're talking about like Nietzsche's reception in Anglophone philosophy. Why does Deleuze think that Nietzsche was not very prominent, say before, I guess, 1962 when this was written? He basically says that the English-speaking world was already kind of doing what Nietzsche was doing, and so he didn't have much to contribute. But what's the
Yeah,
story?
I mean, he's like he says like they're counter to their good sense, but um, yeah, I mean, I guess like they just weren't as wrapped up in the these sort of like pulling it at two sides, just empiricism and pragmatism. Like they kind of found this, like they threaded this needle sort of intuitively on their own.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, the thing is that Nietzsche is often taken to be, you know, the anti-Plato, anti-Kant, and so on. And the English-speaking world was never nearly as metaphysical or rationalist as the German-speaking world,
Mhm.
right? So, you know, like Hume was Nietzsche 100 years before Nietzsche, right? It's like, um, you know, or even like if you go into medieval philosophy and look at the problem of universals, right? Are you familiar with nominalism and the contribution of the nominalists to the question of universals? Does that mean anything to
A
you?
little bit, like yeah, not that much.
So the William of Ockham, who is in English, I don't remember what order he belonged to. No, I think he was a Franciscan actually, and I think that's important for the notion of a kind of decentralized way of thinking about theology or something like that. But in any case, William of Ockham is often taken to be one of the foremost nominalists in the medieval period. So the question of universals, the problem of universals, basically asks the question, what kind of thing are universals? Right? In other words, universals like properties, for instance, like the
Yeah.
property blue or whatever, they're very weird sorts of things for a bunch of reasons. For one thing, they can exist in multiple locations at the same time. Um, they can exist across different entities. Another thing that's weird about universes is that they can exist without being instantiated at all.
Yeah, they don't have to have extension. They're just sort of
Yeah.
things we can think of.
So, right. And so the question is, and this is very similar to the notion of abstract entities, whether or not abstract entities exist. The question is, if universals exist, what kind of thing are they? Now, the nominalists basically respond to that question by saying, well, universals are just ways of talking. They aren't entities. They don't really exist. They have linguistic existence, but they're not entities.
Mhm.
And that was a position that was heavily defended by William of Ockham, a British or English, I guess maybe he wasn't quite, I'm not sure when England became Britain, but in any case, you know, that whole tradition from William of Ockham through Hume, et cetera, up to the American pragmatists and so on, was always a very strong element of Anglophone philosophy. The nominalist picture, there are no abstract entities. All we get is actual things. So, like, one thing about nominalism is it holds that there are no such things as Platonic forms.
Mhm.
Platonic forms are kind of ways of talking, right? The Latin was, I think, flatus vocis, flatulent of the voice.
Yeah.
That's what they are. But what things are is just the collection of, you can't call them the collection of properties in the sense of properties being these universal things. The properties that an entity has are the unique hexeities that they have. Hexeity is a thisness. This is a term that Deleuze uses quite a lot, but heck just means this. And one of the problems that Duns Scotus, another person from the British Isles, developed is there's this problem if we're thinking that uh, entities are like instantiations of concepts, that they're particulars that instantiate a universal.
Mm.
Because you could take any object, anything, any entity, and um, describe it in terms of the sum of universals that it instantiates. But if you're describing it that way, you have one thing left over, the thisness, that can't be described in terms of the instantiation of the universals. Like how does this cup get the thisness? It's not just a collection of universal properties. It's
Mm-hmm.
also this that is referred to as hexeity.
Mm.
And like strong nominalism would just hold that actually everything is just hexaity all the way down. Everything is just this particular collection of, I guess, on a particle theory would say like this collection of atoms and molecules and whatever. But it's not that atoms are somehow like universally identical constituents of existence or something. I mean, this is made out of numerically distinct atoms.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
That's maybe one way of thinking about it. And so like nominalism is pretty heavily anti-metaphysical, or if it's metaphysical at all, it's kind of a flat metaphysics that holds that ultimate reality is just what it is. It's not the particular plus its universals that it instantiates.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So, there's this very long tradition in Anglophone philosophy. Of course, Duns Scotus and Occam weren't writing in English; they were writing in Latin. But in any case, they're from the English speaking world, I guess. Up through the 19th, 20th century, that was very strongly empiricist, nominalist, pragmatist in the sense of questions about value, truth. So like the pragmatic theory of truth is often summarized as follows. We shouldn't be asking, is X true? We should be asking, does X work relative to my interests? Right. So, there was kind of no place for Nietzsche's philosophy to get a foothold because there wasn't really a strong metaphysical dogmatism to critique. That's, I think, the thing he's claiming here. But then he says Nietzsche did have an influence, not with philosophers, but with artists.
Mm-hmm.
So that his impact was stronger with novelists, poets, dramatists, I suppose, musicians too, composers, and so on, which means that it was lyrical but not theoretical, which I think is a kind of interesting way to describe the influence that a philosopher can have. And I think that it's pretty apt for Nietzsche too, because you look at the style in the gay science, and it's like it's not a logical deduction. It's not even really an argument. I mean, he does have argumentative texts. I think the genealogy of morals is generally an argumentative text. It has kind of a thesis and it gives arguments. But the thing about even the genealogy of morals is that it's really more like an allegory than an argument. And the reason I call it an allegory is that he uses historical names of personages, but more than that, ethnic groups and whatever. But the things he claims about these historical societies aren't actually historical. They're not factual. He uses the names of certain people, Greeks or Christians or Jews or whatever, but they're always more like archetypes that stand in for some kind of position. They're not really the specific historical uh, peoples that he names, even though they share the same name. And so it's a strange sort of literary history or literary argument. It is an argument. It does use historical names, but it's presented in some medium that exists between argumentation and fiction.
Mm.
So, and then there's just like the surface style that is very poetic and uses a lot of, in German particularly, he's a very witty and just kind of funny writer, and the sounds of the words he chooses, it's often quite um, aesthetically pleasing and so on. And so,
Mm.
um, there's maybe in the English speaking world, well, Deleuze claims that the influence is lyrical, not philosophical, but I sort of feel like to the extent that Nietzsche's philosophy can be theoretically influential, what it does is bring lyricism into theory, right? It wants to make a place for the creative aspect of thought within arguments, right? So that this is fairly typical romantic slash postmodern kind of thing, where you know Nietzsche to kind of summarize again is not really asking is this true, but is this um, aesthetically powerful? Are my ideas aesthetically powerful, and can the aesthetic power of my ideas actually persuade you to act in a certain way?
Mm. How earlier you were talking about AJ Iyer and
Hmm.
reminding me of like, saying killing is wrong is just an expression of
Hmm.
boo, murder. And it seems
Yeah,
like with
true.
Nietzsche, it's reversed. Like he's going boo, but, and it's our job to interpret whether internally, from a first person perspective, he's thinking killing is wrong, but his outward expression is boo. It's like a creative sort of expression. And
Well,
maybe that's
just
why
to
it
get it
appeals.
closer to Nietzsche, like what certainly the evaluation with Nietzsche is not murder is wrong, but what is the evaluation that you would want to attribute to Nietzsche in this description of what he's doing?
Oh, I'm just saying, like, maybe what he's doing is the opposite of maybe what, yeah, instead of like he's expressing and, he's not like saying a proposition or like what maybe seems like as an imperative, right? But it's the
Mhm.
opposite. They're all just like these, like, maybe raw expressions of, um, from the outside. That's what it looks like.
Let me see if I'm clear on this. Are you wanting to say that Nietzsche is kind of an emotivist about value, or are you saying that he's anti-emotivist, or something other than those two options?
So does saying boo, is that being
To say
emotivist?
that boo, or I'm sorry, to say that murder is wrong doesn't have ethical value is just an expression of emotion. It's like I don't like murder, but
Right.
or like if instead of saying always help the weak, I just go when I see somebody helping the weak. That is not a statement of fact. It's not true or false. It's just an
Hmm.
expression of emotion. And emotivism holds that that's what uh, sentences about moral values are.
Mm,
That, ethical claims aren't true or false. They're just the same thing as screaming when you're angry. That's what
right.
emotivism is, right? So the boo murder
Right.
is just an expression of emotion. It isn't a claim about the truth value of the sentence murder is wrong.
Right.
Right. Okay. So what I was trying to get clear on in what you were saying is if you're saying that Nietzsche is an emotivist or is an anti-emotivist or is some other option.
Yeah, he's doing the latter, I think.
He's
Where
an anti-emotivist or he's doing
Yeah,
something.
so anti. So he's just going boo.
Okay. I'm trying to what job is Boo doing? Is saying Boo is kind of, aesthetic uses of language and so on. That's what we mean by Boo, I think, right? But what
Yeah.
job is it doing for Nietzsche, do you think?
Um, I don't know. I think this is where like maybe you're talking about lyrical and theoretical, and I'm thinking of like
Mm,
Dionysus and Apollo, and
mm,
maybe this is where like the Dionysian part of the writing is kind of coming through, and as opposed to
mhm,
like a more rational, propositional way of putting it, the Apollonian way or whatever.
mm.
Um, I don't know, or yeah.
I mean, I think maybe I would say that Nietzsche is some third option. He's neither emotivist or anti-emotivist. Because the thing about, I mean, technically, emotivism does not hold that um, moral value cannot possibly exist. It's more a question about whether we can say anything true or false about it. But I think that Nietzsche is not really that interested in the question of truth and falsity at all. Right. I think what he would want to probably separate or maybe fuse these ideas of truth valued statements versus expressions of emotion. It's not that there are statements that are true or false and then there are expressions of emotion. I think what he would want to say is that emotion actually taps us into the true nature of reality much better than uh, true or false assertions about it.
Mhm.
Right? It somehow gets us closer to the becoming nature of reality than statements that we take to be true, right? Because
Mhm.
Well, that's what you're saying, right? About like it's a little maybe um, it maybe doesn't quite go far enough to say that like he didn't have a theoretical influence on philosophy. He just had this kind of lyrical influence. It's like, well, injecting the lyricism into it, like that is doing work by itself.
yeah, exactly. That's what I was trying to say. So it's like, right. So if his theoretical contribution is to make us doubt the authority of truth evaluative statements, right? That's a theoretical position. But he does
Mhm.
it performatively, he does it through aesthetic means, right? He
Mm.
doesn't have a propositional argument where he says this is why truth evaluative statements are insufficient, blah blah blah. He just does it in his style,
Mm.
Yeah,
through using exclamation points and writing explosively, et cetera, whatever. But that lyricism as a um, maybe equal partner, or even maybe as the driving force in theory, bringing that into theory in that way, I think is a pretty huge theoretical contribution. In addition
yeah.
to,
I mean that's like saying that like the form of the dialogue isn't doing any work. It's like no, it is doing work, right? Like
yeah, sure.
the style is also part of the theory. Like it's doing work as well.
Right. And I think that kind of like I was trying to say that contra positivism, Nietzsche probably would not want to uphold this strong distinction between things like emotions and things like assertions. I
Mhm.
think that he would also not want to uphold a strong distinction between style and content. That content
Right.
is the style. The style is the content. What is this? So the distinction between style and content, I think, is actually very similar to the distinction between being and becoming, right? Like the style is the particular becoming surface of the idea in the Platonic sense, right? And so maybe the idea is the main thing in the traditional view, and the style is kind of derivative or surface level or just less important. Could even lead you astray if you think that style over substance is a problem. But I think what Nietzsche would want to say is no, actually, there aren't two worlds of
Mm.
coming and being, of style and idea. There's one world.
Mm.
Style and content are the same thing. We
Well,
shouldn't
Deleuze
confuse.
certainly seems to think so. I mean,
Yeah.
and that's why he brings up the Mallarmé poem, right? About
Mhm.
which is like a hyper stylized, right?
Mhm.
And the way it's laid out on the page, and the content and the style, there's like completely intertwined in something
Mhm.
like that.
Yeah. So we're talking about the very strange sort of use of history in genealogy of morals, and Deleuze does mention this with respect to Nietzsche's untimeliness, which I think is a very good and important move, because we often think that we've got two choices. Either we've got time and history and that kind of thing, or we've got eternity. But what Deleuze wants to claim is that Nietzsche is neither an eternal thinker an eternalist thinker, the logical order, nor is he a historical thinker, a thinker that holds that the world is exhaustively describable in terms of causal relations. He's some third possibility. Maybe it's a unity of these things, or it is just some third thing that is untimely. And I think that probably the best way to think about it is to remember that Deleuze and Nietzsche, and according to Deleuze, Heraclitus even, are one world philosophers. They want to reject this idea of a distinction between the eternal world and the world of the here and now. So, trying to find ways that eternity and history, for instance, can be collapsed into a single, whatever, a
Mm.
single world. I was going to say a single medium, but the very idea of a medium presupposes that it's in between two things, you know. But I think that, with respect to what I was saying as regards the problem of free will and imperatives and so on, maybe that's another way to think about what he's doing too. See if there's a way to describe everything as existing immanently in a single world instead of always positing some sort of disembodied separate world that is distinct from what we actually experience. Uh,
Would it be fair to you know, so we have eternal sort of like concern with like logic and like universals, right? And then historical to say like sort of like what we would say like critical, right? Would be maybe that sort of third thing that Nietzsche's doing.
we'll flesh that out a little bit more. Why would a critical project somehow be a third thing?
I mean, I guess because it's trying to sort of get it like it almost is like a meta project, right? Of those two things, right? Of uh, sitting in between these two things, right? We're not trying just to be look at causes and things like that historically. We're not trying just to posit sort of like necessary truths, right? We're trying to
Hmm.
I don't know, like on mind like deeper reasons underneath these things or something like that, or
Yeah,
yeah, or sort of situate ourselves in a certain way um,
right.
within the arguments.
What I would say to that is that so I think we always have to come back to that imperative to read the room. What I mean by that is it's easy to think of ways that critical projects could become ultimately platonic, right? Like when you were saying deeper reasons, right? Like it would be easy to have maybe a fairly shallow critique that like the shallow reading of the culture industry critique, for instance, Adorno, right? It's like, well, we think that society works this way, but actually, this is the real
Mm.
motor of society. This is the real logical structure of, commodity fetishism and all this kind of stuff. It's easy to turn that into a Platonic picture. And what I was going to say is, yeah, I think you're probably right to a certain extent. Critique does bring together elements of non-temporal thinking, eternal logical thinking, and historical thinking. But I think it comes down to who's doing it and how they're doing it, whether it's
Mm.
actually going to be this, third or even only, not really a third world, but the only world picture, right? The one world picture. Because there are ways and a lot of people working in critical traditions end up actually being pretty Platonic with respect to uncovering, like the very idea of false consciousness, right, which is such a huge part of Marxian critique. Um, one thing Adorno tries to do is hold that all of that exists is false consciousness. Deleuze is going to reject that because it's too negative. But that would be one way of trying to avoid being a Platonist. But the problem with false consciousness is that it seems to presuppose true consciousness.
Right.
And true,
Yeah.
true consciousness seems like well, isn't that just the Platonic picture?
Mm.
Right. And so, yeah, you have to do it in a really fragile and subtle and supple way that avoids getting stuck, reified, or crystallized into um, an eternalist way of thinking. And I think there are ways to do it. Probably the aesthetic, means that people like Nietzsche or other kind of hybrid artistic slash philosophical thinkers use is maybe one way to keep uh, the approach living and not let it just settle into some kind of um, Platonic analysis that holds that we've uncovered the real logical structure of society. Um, I mean, one thing you said, which I think also might help to avoid that reification, is as long as um, the problems that you're addressing are always socially contingent and historically contingent, right? So, like, um, the sort of critique, I guess, that Kant was writing is way different from the sort of critique that people are would be writing now, or at least it could be done quite differently because the problems are different.
Mm.
So I suppose as long as you always think that the problems and the responses that you give to the problems are thought in terms of this constant historical change and flux, et cetera, that you could avoid an eternalist picture. But still, I think it really comes down to like, how exactly did you write this text? How exactly did you produce this, say, piece of art that is critical or whatever? One of the things about writing about art, I don't know if you've ever written, you probably have written proposals to get like whatever, a commission or something, and then you try to write about how your music is socially relevant and stuff.
Yeah,
The
the
thing
worst.
is that those descriptions, the reason they're insufficient is that what makes, or at least one of the things, necessary condition of good work of art, I think, is its specific and precise articulation, right? Like there's a sense, if we're going with a two-world picture, that if I have a strong idea, not just a strong idea, but like a true idea, if what I want to argue is true, if I have a kind of awkward use of language or an awkward presentation, that doesn't actually detract from the truth of the idea, right? So the style is kind of irrelevant. I mean, maybe it makes it harder to show people why what I'm saying is true, but it's not that the truth is somehow dependent on the articulation of the truth. But the thing about art is that it is very dependent on how it is articulated,
Mm.
right? Art is very surface oriented in a way that, truth oriented discourses maybe don't have to be so surface oriented.
Mhm.
So, that's why it's like, you look at all these philosophers, Kant or whoever, and they're terrible writers because I don't think that the specific style, the specific articulation of the ideas matters. What matters is the truth of the ideas. But if we want to avoid this kind of our eternalist picture, we have to somehow take on board that the specific, concrete articulation is the way in which the truth can be presented, right? We don't want to think of the truth as separate from its articulation. And so, that's one way of kind of trying to exemplify this idea that, yeah, maybe critique could be a way of getting past this eternalist versus historicist dichotomy, but it's really going to depend on who's writing and how they're writing.
Mhm. Mhm.
See if we can at least knock out the rest of the preface because we're going pretty slow, much slower than I expected. We should talk about the difference between force and power because this is going to be big. Um, what are forces in at least Deleuze's interpretation of Nietzsche? He's got the active forces and the reactive forces, which have some bearing on, I guess, mastery and slavery. However, it's not a one-to-one relationship between, it's not that the masters are active and the slaves are reactive. You can have reactive masters, and there's a sort of creativity in the ressentiment of the slaves as well. And then there's this idea of power, which is significant. And what Deleuze really wants to do is disabuse us of our manosphere podcast understanding of these things, right? The will to power is not about, might makes right or just, exert your will, and whoever fails to exert their will is bad or whatever. He wants to make it much more mm, subtle and complex. But what did you get from this? We can also just go line by line because, I think that the lines in the outline are pretty evocative. So like the first thing I write under force is that propositions are crystallizations of forms of life, and that every proposition expresses a mode of existence, a type. Now, this idea of typology is actually also important here. Remember what I said about how the genealogy of morals is presented? It's nominally historical. He uses historical names and I think a few historical events as sort of like avatars for what he wants to, the picture he wants to paint. But as I said, actually, it doesn't take long before you realize that they're not factual representations of these historical groups. So what are they? They're a sort of type. This is at least what Deleuze claims. But then we have to ask, well, wait, what is this type language? It seems like um, aren't types basically Platonic? Aren't types basically like the forms of, whatever the particulars are?
Mm.
So how is Nietzsche using type in a way that avoids that kind of eternalist picture? What do you think about that? What is this type sort of idea?
I mean, I could just I just kind of substitute like kinds, like we would think of like I don't know, which I guess is still sort of a Platonic sort of
Yeah.
view of it, right? Yeah. Or I mean, it also made me think of sort of like McIntyre. We'll call them like characters, right,
Hmm.
with the capital C,
Hmm. Yeah.
as
Okay.
these sort of
No, go ahead.
like almost like literary types, right, that we can sort of map onto.
Yeah, I think the literary angle is really important, right? Like essentially Nietzsche is using uh, historical groups and people, whatever, as a mask that he wears in order to present his ideas, right? And
Hmm.
actually, one of
Yeah.
the things that Deleuze claims, which is interesting, is that whenever a force, we have to define what forces are first of all, I guess, but whenever a force overtakes another, it only does that by first adopting its mask and sort of working against it from within the image of the force that it is opposed to, right? And so I think maybe that's one way of thinking about types. Types as masks, not that they are the true Platonic forms of whatever the particulars are, but that they are sort of like a persona in the original sense of a mask. A persona was actually the name for the mask that an actor would wear, right? Um, that if they're literary characters, if we think of types as literary characters, and if it's what I said was true about the way that literature and other aesthetic media are always hyper particular, then we can think of these types as like very concrete exemplars of an idea, right? So that it's not that I mean, to a certain extent, it does seem like in the genealogy of morals, he's kind of describing some very basic properties of the human condition that like kind of are universal in a way, but he's doing it in a way that presents these types as specific characters that he uses the way he wants to use them. In other words, I once had a professor that, in talking about how to use sources and use quotations, uh, suggested that the point isn't really to like uncover what the source means or what the authentic original intention of the speaker is, but rather to use use these voices, use these quotes to say what you want to say. In other words, it's
He's
not that,
definitely.
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, no. When I was reading, it seemed like Deleuze was definitely doing that instead of expressing his point of view. He would just like put a quote of. Nietzsche's.
In fact, the very what I said at the very beginning of this session, right? Like this idea that we always have to ask ourselves: is what he's doing exegesis of Nietzsche, or is he using Nietzsche as a mask to say what he wants to say?
Oh yeah.
Right? I think that maybe that's the way type is working here.
Mm.
This sort of literary mask, it's a fiction. And notice that that's already an inversion of the Platonic picture. The form is supposed to be true, and the particular is somehow an illusion. But here, the type, if it's like this sort of mask, which is itself a kind of fiction, that nonetheless helps you say what you want to say, um, the type is it's both true and false in a way. And so maybe that's also a way of bringing dichotomous worlds together or something.
So behind the types, there's also the essence, isn't there? Like force that has the most affinity towards a thing.
True.
And is,
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
oh, and is that who you are?
Well, what does he say about the affinity that a thing has to its essential force? I love how, man, that is one new agey sounding sentence. What does he say about the affinity that it has, that a thing has to its essential force? Okay, get your crystals. Um, but what does he say about it? Is it really essence in the eternalist sense, or is it something else?
Oh yeah, no, it's no, it's not in the eternal sense. I forget what he actually says now.
Well, I mean, essentially, it's just that essences are always provisional in two different ways. One, they're not eternal because they can always be overcome by other forces, but also they're interest relative, right? So,
Mm.
like, like the most mundane example of this is like, this is a cup to me because it fulfills the particular interests that make it a cup to me. Like it holds beverages that I want to drink and keeps them warm and all this kind of stuff. But if I had different interests, it would not be a cup anymore. It might be part of a musical instrument, or it might be something that I put over a spider to, I don't know, throw it outside or whatever, right? So um, there's not like an essential feature of this thing that is that is a feature of its intrinsic properties. It's not that this is a cup because it has intrinsic properties that make it essentially a cup. It's a cup because it has this sort of interest relative affordance to me.
Mhm.
It
Mhm.
affords the ability to hold beverages. It affords me the ability to keep my beverages warm and drink them and so on. Um, I think that's a way of thinking about what essence is here, right? It's not certainly not eternal because it can always change, but it's also even at any given time, it's not, like the one true being of the thing. That's always relative to interests.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think this first part, though, this idea of propositions being crystallizations of forms of life, that's pretty important. I mean, that's another way kind of saying what I was saying, where um, it's interesting that he says propositions, because actually I don't think anybody disagrees that propositions are crystallizations of forms of life, although I suppose there might be people that, like Frege, would probably hold that the sense of a proposition is mind independent and is not just a crystallization of a form of life. Maybe this
Mhm.
is a fairly pragmatic way of thinking about what propositions are. But the very idea of it being a crystallization of form of life seems to hold that it's descriptive, right?
Mm.
And most people hold that propositions are descriptive. Uh, they're not somehow action guiding unless they have some kind of imperative element or some evaluative element. Um, but I think thinking about value as an expression of a form of life is maybe something a little bit newer here, where it's not that values are action guiding, rather they are expressions of how we live, what we value through our action, and that kind of thing. Uh, and actually what I was saying about, to what you had to say about critique, and then I said, yeah, it's probably going to come down to who's writing it and how they're writing it. He says that in this next bit where he thinks that Nietzsche wants to change the question from what does this proposition mean what are its truth conditions or something, and wants to replace that with the question, who is saying it? What form of life does it express? Right? Who's saying it? How are they saying it? Why are they saying it? That's maybe more revealing than thinking that it somehow uncovers some eternal mind independent truth, life independent truth.
Yeah, because he wants to like have a value of values or something like that, right?
Yeah,
So
so
that we're not
right.
just concerned with the value of the proposition, right? We're concerned with like evaluating the the way that we would evaluate the proposition.
Yeah, what I took him to mean there was so like there's a sentence very early on that puzzled me for a while, and I was trying to figure out why he would claim that Kant was unable to deal with value in his critical project. Like, what are you talking about? Kant, like the second critique is all about value. What do you, you know?
Mhm.
But this idea of the not asking about the value of value
Mhm.
means, I think, that what Nietzsche is interested is creating new values, right? Transvaluating the values
Yes.
that he encounters, whereas Kant is actually just giving an apology for the status quo, kind of,
Mhm.
like Lutheran or pietist morality, but making it into
Yeah.
this huge rational structure and so on, right? And I think that's what he's saying.
Okay.
That Kant didn't sufficiently understand that his values weren't from God; they were from his way of life.
Mhm.
I think is kind of the idea there. Um, and we've got the active and reactive forces. What is the way of life? What is someone's way of life? It's whatever the balance of forces are at any given time, I guess. And the balance of forces is going to be between active forces and reactive forces, active being growing, sort of overflowing creativity, versus reactive forces, which are defensive, which are destructive, perhaps, um, that limit creativity. And then he has this thing about the reactive creativity of ressentiment and bad conscience. Should we spend a minute on that? We have kind of said a word or two about that, but is
Yeah, I
it
mean, I
clear?
understand like what his means by ressentiment and bad conscience. I guess it's a little bit less clear to me, like how that is creative. He seems so concerned with like, you know, the creative act and being different and all this stuff, and then to say that, well, then like ressentiment is also creative.
Mhm.
Um,
You
I
want
guess
to
that's
say
a little
what
bit
about
harder for me to
that,
unpack.
Sandesh? I've got my answer, but I want to give you guys a chance to jump in.
Um, yeah, it reminds me of our conversation about good and bad and good and evil,
Uh-huh.
and how, let's say, descriptively in the world, we say there's good things and bad things. And then what the slaves did was invent evil, which is like a third term, in order to characterize the masters. And thus we're able to like do this reversal of values. Um, and that's a creative act. And that's ressentiment or whatever, right?
That's true. Yeah, definitely. I think probably maybe the larger kind of point here is even though Nietzsche himself, although he doesn't really talk about Hegel much, and Deleuze certainly wants Nietzsche to be an anti-Hegelian, I think that Nietzsche does have a sort of element of sublation or kind of like higher expression of lower order, um, lower order relationships or whatever that can be expressed in higher and higher ways, or more and more interesting or more and more complex ways. I think one of the things that ressentiment enables is awareness, right? Like, in order to have ressentiment, you have to be able to say that those people are different from me. You have to be able to differentiate yourself from just, the flow of experience, right?
Yeah,
You have to say
that makes
that
sense.
I disavow that, right? Whatever your so ressentiment actually, even if you take like the most kind of superficial view of it, it's like, okay, those people are doing what they do. I can't do what I do, and so no longer think of myself as bad. I flip it around and I call them bad. That still requires that you be able to recognize that there's a you,
Mhm.
right? Now, it doesn't mean that that you is somehow like a transcendental subject that, is perfectly unified or whatever. It might be some kind of fairly irrational, subconscious kind of flux or something, but it does require that you have some kind of self-awareness so that you can separate yourself from that which you want to call bad. I think that that's the most important creative move. And it's true that, amoebas produce things, they act and whatever, but I think Nietzsche would have to say that they're not authors, right? They don't create in the sense that an author creates because they're not really conscious. In order to have that sort of higher sort of creativity, that sort of higher, and higher really doesn't mean ethically better or anything like that. It just means more interesting. In order to have a more interesting relationship to the world, you have to be able to see yourself as, in some respect, different from the world, or at least different from those things in the world that you denigrate by not doing them,
Mhm.
right? So I think that's the creative move of ressentiment. It's that, when I was reading this, it started reminding me of Kristeva, right? Do you remember Kristeva and the whole objection picture, Sandesh? This idea that in order to achieve some sort of self-aware identity, you first go through a period of disgust where you disavow everything about like, so like the idea, I guess, on a physical level is we begin life not as an individual, we begin life as an extension of our mother's body or something. And even when we're born, we don't really have a unified sense of identity. We're for one thing covered in feces all the time, and very closely sort of tied to our mother's body and so on. And then there's a certain phase of child development where the child starts to want to reject all of that stuff, wants to reject its dependence on the mother, wants to reject all the kind of disgusting aspects of being a helpless infant. And what's important is that feeling, that emotion of disgust, because that's an implicit evaluation, right? You need to have that kind of sense of disgust, revulsion towards the not me in order to develop the sense of a me. I think there's something
Yeah,
very,
like it produces the differentiation.
yeah, exactly. I think that there's something very
Mhm.
similar here with ressentiment, right? Before
Yeah,
ressentiment,
yeah.
or prior to ressentiment, he's got this pathos of distance. And I think the pathos of distance is that sort of like, oh, it's disgusting. And not that it's morally disgusting necessarily. Like if I'm a master and I just, whatever, kill who I want, have all the sexual encounters I want or whatever, the things the masters do. Um, I might not think that I'm ethically better than the slaves, but the slaves disgust me,
Mhm.
right? And I think that baseline level of disgust, of that differencing, I'm special. What I do is what I value. What they do, which I see as bad because they can't do what I do, maybe even just physically or socially, they can't. They're not strong enough to get what they want. But that's connected with this sense of a kind of disgust, which is a precondition for individuation, and that's a creative move, I think. So
Hmm.
that's the way I would interpret that, right? That it enables a kind of individuation that enables like authorship in a way, because otherwise you're
Mhm.
just an amoeba.
Yeah.
In the last few minutes, I mean, I think that the rest of the reactive forces is pretty straightforward. It's not that slaves are reactive and masters are active. Um, Reactivity really has to do with a kind of uh, negation that's not productive, right? So, like, whenever you have a reactionary government. Like, I always think of like Ron DeSantis or whatever, and the way like his whole identity is just a rejection of wokeness.
Right. There's
You
no
know?
creative act in that, is what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
But there's no
exactly
positive vision, is like how we would like in like political theory. Like,
right. Exactly. So, it's important to keep in mind that active forces and reactive forces are always in some kind of balance at any given time. And it's not just from person to person. I mean, it's like a feature of the world, I guess. Like
yeah.
everything is really just the balance of these different, kinds of forces, or maybe even we could think of force as one thing and it having multiple different sorts of functions, right? There's an active function versus a reactive function. I mean, one thing that Deleuze is going to want to argue is that the nature of reality is plural. It's not unified. So I guess
Right.
force can't just be one thing. But maybe even thinking of it as a thing is not the right way to think about it. It's probably more like a verb, and the verb can have multiple plural functions or something like that. That's what the active and the reactive aspect are.
Mhm.
What about power? The will to power. What does it say about the will to power? Does not mean just might makes right, just, doing what you feel
Right.
like, or even the desire to be able to do what you feel like. But it's rather power emerges in the dynamic interplay of conflicting forces, but not as an absence.
Hmm.
The interplay is an interesting way of talking about difference, right? Like the interplay is neither side of the interplay, right? The interplay itself is not the players, but it's also
Ah.
not a gap,
Mm.
right? It's the mutual permeation, co-constitution of what we might call players or what we might call entities or identities. But the interplay itself is actually neither of the identities, and it's also not an absence.
Yeah.
And power is one way of describing that interplay of the different functions of forces.
Hmm.
The next part was actually kind of important because he talks about how power expresses itself in dynamic qualities. That's, I think, on maybe page, I'm not sure exactly where it is, but this idea that power is qualitative is really one way of thinking about forces and their reactive versus active functions in terms of affirmation and negation. And here, the important thing is to remember, Kant's category of quality that it has affirmation, negation, and limitation, or the affirmative, the negative, and the infinite
Mm.
judgments. Interestingly, Deleuze doesn't really talk about the infinite judgment much here. He does talk a lot about affirmation and negation, but I think that Kant preceded him with this idea of the infinite judgment and this idea of negation as productive, right?
Yeah.
It's not just negation as absence, but so really, I think what Deleuze is trying to adopt is a sort of infinite notion of quality, right? Like, yes, negation, destruction is always part of life, but it's not negative in the sense of only producing absences. Destruction is itself a productive act,
Hmm.
sort of like a forest fire or whatever, the way the forest fire makes new life possible and that sort of thing. One maybe kind of important thing to think about, however, is that so like in Bergsonism, Deleuze's book from about 4 years after this, he sets up this distinction between heterogeneous difference, which is qualitative, and homogeneous difference, which is quantitative.
Mm.
And so when he's talking about quality here, he's really talking about difference as um, continual or continuous self-othering, in other words, becoming, and not difference as the gap in between identities.
Hmm.
But one thing he says in Bergsonism, which is kind of interesting, is that both the heterogeneous difference, which he kind of equates with Bergson's duration. If you remember duration, have you read any Bergson, Daniel? Um,
Nope.
how can we sum up
I'll
duration?
have to. I'll have to
Yeah.
go look at
How can we sum up
find one of
duration
those.
in one sentence, Sandesh? Um,
Oh, hmm.
okay, so like duration is what is essentially duration is essentially Bergson's name for consciousness, although it's
Yeah.
consciousness understood as um, a continuous process of self-differentiation, right? So like let's think about time. Well, I'm already on sentence two.
I mean, do you mean like in a sense of like sort of like analog versus digital, right? There's not this like self and then other, but there's this sort of
It's a
like
little bit
continual
like that.
process of it.
It's
Yeah.
a little bit
Okay.
like that. Yeah, sure. Okay. So like, but duration is okay. So like one thing we might have a problem with if we're thinking about unity is that it's static,
Mhm.
right? Like, Parmenides the one, for instance, it's like there's no change whatsoever. Even change is an illusion. Any kind of difference is an illusion. Um, but if the only alternative is some sort of notion of difference as a plurality of entities that aren't related, that aren't ultimately subsumable under a one, then we have this kind of atomism where we can never have relation. Nothing is ever in
Mhm.
relation, right? And so the question is, how can you reconcile these? And essentially, duration is one attempt at that. It's understanding difference that is always continuous. So, like when we think about continuous change over time, um, you can't splice it up into distinct entities that are different. There's one changing process, but if I look at time point one and time point n, I've got a really different state,
Yeah.
but there's no limitation of one entity changing into another entity. It's all, even thinking about entities is wrong. It's a verb, right? The verb is what is metaphysically fundamental. That's more
Mhm.
or less what duration is. And Bergson thinks that that's very descriptive of consciousness. Like for instance, the consciousness of time, we always describe time in terms of points,
Yeah.
minutes or seconds or whatever, but of course we don't actually experience that. We experience it as a continuity.
Mhm.
And so the continuity is a unity, but it's a unity of difference because there aren't these boundaries between entities. It's all one-ish. I mean, it's not an entity, but
Mhm.
it's not different in the sense of different entities. There's no gap in it. There's no boundaries in it. And yet it's always changing, right? So that's more or less duration. And Deleuze thinks that that kind of heterogeneous difference, what he calls heterogeneous difference, is more or less the same thing as Bergson's idea um, of duration. And he thinks that homogeneous difference is the sort of difference where you've got a gap between entities.
Mhm.
Mm.
We don't have time to describe why that's homogeneous and so on, but it doesn't really matter. What he wants to say, however, is that um, so the first one, heterogeneous difference, you can think of in terms of, I think that's difference in kind, and the homogeneous difference is difference of degree, or is it the other way around? I don't remember. But the point is that it's kind of weird that we've got two different kinds of differences of degree and differences of kind,
Yeah.
homogeneous difference and heterogeneous difference. And so, appealing to the principle of division in Aristotle, he holds that both of those are just expressions of some underlying difference in itself that you can't
Mhm.
articulate.
Yeah.
Pretty easy
Some
to
like.
articulate Bergson's idea of difference is continuous change.
Mhm.
And it's easy to articulate it as the gap between two things. But both of those are actually just species of difference in itself, which you can't articulate because
Yeah.
any,
Difference as such is quite a bit harder to describe.
right, exactly. So anyway, when he's talking about quality and forms of life as being, or power as being expressed in the dynamic qualities of forces as they give rise to forms of life and so on, he's kind of talking about it in this Bergsonian sense, I think, of this sort of whatever continuity, maybe instead of unity, we can call it a continuity of affirmation and negation, right? Of being and becoming and so on. And then he says this really kind of inscrutable thing. He says, power is not what the will wants. Power is the one that wants in the will.
Yeah, that was the one that I circled in with a big question mark in my page.
I have an interpretation. I'm not sure if it's what Deleuze means, but in the spirit of Deleuze, we don't have to get him quote unquote right. We have to use
Right.
him creatively.
Yes.
Have
Yes.
to make him speak for us. I think here's my interpretation of it. The one that wants in the will is the subject, just as the subject in Kant is required to will whatever maxims. You've got a subject-like function in Deleuze, a self. However, what's different about the Deleuzian self is not that it's a static entity. Difference is the sort of most fundamental level of consciousness, right? So what we've got is like a kinetic subject in Deleuze. Yes, the will has a subject. There is a one that wants in the will. The power is really just the one who wants in the will. But the one who wants in the will isn't a Kantian transcendental subject. It's difference.
Hmm.
How are you doing with that, Daniel? You seem either
I
perplexed or unconvinced.
yeah, I probably just have to sit with it for a little bit.
I mean, that makes sense in some ways because we're trying to talk about a subject not in terms of in like an atomistic way, but in terms of
Yeah.
forces.
We're
And
Yeah,
also
I
not,
mean,
it's also not an identity in the way
right.
that the transcendental subject is not really an identity for us. Actually, Kant says we have no access to the transcendental subject. We can see its effects. We posit it as a theoretical entity, essentially, to explain how it's possible that we can make sense of experience. We don't actually have immediate grasp of it. It's a transcendental entity, but it does underwrite identity thinking. It's that still point of the turning world, right? It's that thing that enables us to make sense of the flux of experience.
yeah, like it's a position or a perspective.
Well, I think actually it's more than just a perspective. I think it's a perspective in the sense of giving coherence to the human experience of the world, right?
Mm.
But it's not a perspective in the sense of uh, an opinion that is different from person to person, right? It underwrites logical communication.
Mm.
Like the only way we can communicate is if we, at least on some basic level, agree about meanings and logical.
No, I don't mean perspective in that sense. I mean like frame of reference perspective, right? Like a
Yeah, yeah. But the point is that yes, transcendental idealism is perspectival, definitely, because we don't see reality as it is. We see reality as it's set up for us by the categories and the understanding and so on. But what enables that basic act of synthesis is the transcendental subject. So the
mm.
transcendental subject really is nothing more than the synthetic unity of apperception, the synthetic unity of self-consciousness. That's what it is. But the point is, it's unity, right? It's this sort of form-like, form-granting aspect of consciousness that brings things together so that we can understand them, recognize them, and so on.
And you're wanting to have like this disunity or like unstable version of that.
I think that Deleuze flips that around to a degree. He's still a transcendentalist in the sense that Kant has, transcendental idealism. However, Deleuze in Difference and Repetition develops this theory of transcendental empiricism as opposed to transcendental idealism. There, the idea is that, well, what underwrites these identities that we call the categories of the understanding? He thinks that those identities are essentially snapshots of these underlying forces. They're
Mm.
ways of sort of describing, maybe regularities or even just, states of the sort of underlying forces, which we might describe as, I mean, on a biological level, we might say that life is presupposed in consciousness. but life itself is not conscious. Life is a force. That's maybe a biological way of describing it, right? That like, well, wait a minute. Before we can make sense of the world, we have to already be living in the world. We have to already um, be experiencing before we make sense of experience, right? And so I think that his transcendental subject, he calls his transcendental subject, by the way, he calls it Dionysus, or at least he calls what he takes Nietzsche's the one that wants in the will.
Right,
He
right,
says
yeah.
it's Dionysus, which then makes me think, yeah, that's probably what he means. That he hasn't developed the theory of transcendental empiricism yet, but the subject of transcendental empiricism would be a living subject, not a eternally fixed unity. Not that Kant's transcendental subject is eternal necessarily, but with respect to the way we make sense of experience, it gives that aspect to our experience that we could call its eternal form. So, like when you say that, you know, all dogs are mammals, for instance, and when you see a dog, you see its mammalhood too, I guess. Um, there's a sense in which your seeing of the dog is presupposing this element of eternity with respect to how the concept's being applied, because that's what it means for it to be an adequate
Um,
concept, that it is like the unchanging definition of it, right?
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
so that aspect of eternity, even if it's not real, it's not reality in itself. It's reality as it shows up to us. Within reality as it shows up to us is an element of the eternal, according to Kant. And that element of the eternal is a function of the synthesis of the transcendental subject.
mm,
Um, I think what Deleuze is wanting to say is that here's the way Deleuze actually says it in Difference in Repetition. He doesn't like Kant because he thinks that Kant is preoccupied with uncovering the conditions of possible experience. And what he wants to do is uncover the conditions of actual experience.
Mm.
Possible
mm,
experience means that you simply uncover what logical forms or types have to be in place in order to have any possible experience at all.
Yeah.
But Deleuze wants to say, how is it, or wants to ask anyway, how is it that we not only um, experience the world, but we experience it as this world? So it's that problem of hexaity again, right? And so he wants to build that sort of um, that non-eternal, specific, empirical level of consciousness down at a fundamental level. And so his subject is going to be a subject that is an empiricist and not a rationalist. It's not uncovering the hidden unity in experience. It's uncovering the hidden thisness in experience, the hidden or the, I suppose, constitutive particularity of experience, right? And so for him, consciousness is particular all the way down. It's empirical all the way down. And he thinks that Kant is rationalist all the way down or universal all the way down. And so
mm,
it's still a kind of transcendental picture, but it flips it from the Platonic or the Parmenidean picture to the Heraclitean picture, right? Like he's got Heraclitus as his transcendental subject instead of Parmenides.
mm. Yeah,
Uh,
because Kant would
you're throwing a
say
lot
the
of words,
world.
Daniel.
No, that part makes sense. It's just hard. Like I understand that unpacking, but just like within like the point to the will to power, like how that
Oh, I see.
right, how that ties in, I guess. But I
Yeah.
mean that we'll unpack that, I'm sure,
Yeah,
throughout
and
the
also I
the
think
entire
Deleuze hasn't
reading.
really treated that much. We're still just in the preface. Yeah, I'm not
Yeah.
totally sure, except that, like what I said about action versus reflection, I think is probably going to be an
Hmm.
important thing, right? Like there is a traditional distinction between action and thought, right? Like
Right.
like Zeno, or whoever is like, think before you act or whatever. And what Deleuze wants to hold, I think, is that thinking properly understood. And it's hard to get away from like the traditional lingo because maybe it's not really understanding, but a more adequate way of describing thinking is to think of it itself as an activity that should be harnessed in the interest of creativity, right? Because
Mhm.
action is creative. When you act in the world, you produce new states of affairs, as opposed to thinking about pre-existing states of affairs. But thought itself is an activity. So thought
Yep.
really should just be understood as a creative act that brings about reality, that produces new states of affairs. And I think that, thinking about, so like the Kantian subject is pretty reflective, right? It's like trying to uncover the universal stability of the concept in experience, the unity. And I think Deleuze's subject is going to be more action oriented, more creative. And that's probably why he links it to power, because power, here's one way of saying it, right? You could think of Kant as uncovering the timeless, universal structure of ethical action, right? Like we act in different ways, but really what Kant's interested in is finding this sort of uh, um, absolutely true, even if it's only internal to our perspective, but within the perspective, this absolutely true rational analysis of morality.
Mhm.
But the empirical subject of Deleuze would ask, why are you doing that project? Right? Why are you choosing to use your time this way, Kant?
Mm.
And that gets back to this idea of him not questioning the value of his values.
Right.
Mm.
Right. And so power here, I think, is understood as giving rise to thought and thought in the Platonic, Kantian, whatever sense. Not that I want to run Kant and Plato together, they're quite different, various ways, but that thought is actually a way of exerting yourself in the world. It's not just a passive description of the world.
Right, right. Like, what's the phrase? Like,
Mode of existence.
well, he says like Nietzsche doesn't want like he says the will to power is not wanting, but it's like this giving or creating, right? So there's
Mhm.
sort of the
Right.
difference there.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. I mean, I think both desiring power and creating or giving, both of those are more on the action side. They're both kind of decidedly non-Kantian, although it's hard not to make a straw man version of Kant because there are all sorts of exceptions to everything that I say. But there's a sense in which desiring power is also an activity. I mean, it's a little more descriptive maybe because you look at the world and you say that person has power. I don't have power. But then there's also this evaluative element where you want power, right? So even that is more Nietzschean, I suppose, than certainly Platonic, right? Desiring power is still very, world oriented as opposed to floating above the world and just taking an impartial view on it. Um, but I think what he's trying to get at there with the four confusions towards the end of the preface is like really the various ways that like the tech bro uh, blogosphere or not blogosphere, podcastosphere. What is there even
Yeah,
a name for that? The various appropriations of that. The will to power is not like the Pete Hegseth version of it.
yeah.
It's actually um, this sort of it's actually a fairly benevolent way of thinking about what exertions of power could be. They're ways of giving to the world. They're ways of making realities in the world, right? And it doesn't
Yeah,
have, yeah.
I sort of substitute this like yeah, like creative act or willing there to be difference or something. Um, it's yeah, it's very hard to. So much of reading this is like, well, this word we normally think of this, but we have to do this sort of like
Yeah.
mental substitution, and so I'm sort of like trying to track what my substitutions
Well,
are,
what are some of
right? That
those
I make.
words? What are some of the words that are being reappropriated here?
Well, I mean, power obviously is I think
Ah,
like a big one, and then like eternal, right? Because we talk about well, eternal sort of implies that there's no sort of looping because it would never end.
mhm.
Uh, oh, there's another one. I'm like type is one. It's hard not to think of like the analytic terms of like kinds and types and natural kinds and that kind of thing.
Mhm. Yeah,
So I'm
exactly.
having to sort of like develop my like Deleuze vocabulary, I suppose.
Yeah. I think that there are kind of two, we could call them families of contradistinctions that he's trying to bring here. One is using these terms in ways that distinguish them from the major lineage in philosophy, the Platonic tradition. But then there's also he's trying to distinguish them from the misunderstandings of Nietzsche that are really
Mhm.
prevalent, right? And so we should try to be mindful of like when is there a term that nobody mistakes for a Platonic term like Übermensch or something,
Yeah,
Overman
right.
or whatever, but nonetheless gets misunderstood all the time,
Mhm.
right? And so he needs to be able to carve out it's tricky. It's so it's not that there's an original position of Nietzsche, right? That one thing that Nietzsche is very clearly against is the idea of sort of absolute fixed origins, right? It's not that there is one authentic Christianity, for instance, or one authentic Homeric world, and we have to discover the truth of that if we're historians or philologists or whatever. Everything is always in flux, right? So, like, at any given time, like if I'm doing a history of Christianity, and this is something I write a little bit in the outline here, I can always point to pretty major exceptions to any kind of characterization, right?
Mhm.
That's one expression of this idea that when we're talking about origins, we shouldn't think that this is the perfect authentic origin and it could be misunderstood or it develops in various ways. We always have to think of the origin itself as a balance of forces as in play in development at all times. But the thing is that Deleuze also wants to avoid misreadings, right? And
Mhm.
so it's like how do you make that gel? That there's both no originary, specific, authentic, unitary, originary meaning, but you can also have misreadings, right? And so it's that's not that hard to make gel because right, not there is no one right answer, but there are lots of wrong answers. Is maybe one way of looking at
Yeah,
it.
we were talking about this with like there's like sort of the plethora of like good faith interpretations, but then that implies well there are bad faith interpretations.
Yeah, but the point is that the good faith interpret there's not one good faith interpretation, right? It's like
Yeah,
there's
it's
a
plethora.
balance of different interpretations based on interests and perspectives and just balance of forces in the more Deleuzian terminology. Um, and so that doesn't mean that everybody's opinion is right.
Mhm.
Right? You can get it wrong, but the way that you get it right is to recognize the fact that every origin is always in play, right? It's not that there was one original um, idea that we can misunderstand. It's like a collection of. It's sort of like what I was saying with Emerson, where it's like, well, maybe one way that we can have a version of universality that doesn't deny individuality. I'll just finish this and then we can wrap up for the day. Is to think of universality as like the sum total of good faith perspectives, right? It's that sum total aspect that we're calling the origin. It's not that one interpretation is the original. It's that it's actually this productive mix of different interpretations, and depending on your interests, you might have more affinity with one interpretation, which you might call the essence. But that's going to
Mhm.
be relative to your perspective, your interests. It's going to be relative to the point in time that you're making that claim.
Mhm.
So that's what I mean when I say it's always in play. All right. Well, that's a good place to stop. Maybe can we meet a week from now? Is that good? We'll just flesh out the rest of.
Week from now, it's good.
Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah.
no new reading. We'll just get through as much of chapter one as possible, and then.
Mhm.
Are you good to commit to lead chapter two, Daniel, or do you want to think about it more?
I can do that. Yeah,
So we'll try to do chapter two in 2 weeks. We'll see how far we get with everything next week, but it's a good place to stop for now.
that sounds
Okay,
good.
I will see you all next week.
Okay.
See you next week.
See
Bye
ya.
bye.